So today I'd like to try to answer the question, what is jiu-jitsu? But I don't want to answer the question at the superficial level. You can Google what is jiu-jitsu and you'll find out it's a grappling-based martial art that originated in Japan. Eventually, a judo master named Maeda took it to Brazil, where the Gracies and others evolved it further, and eventually it came to the United States, and now it's a worldwide phenomenon. You know, we know all that, and if you're watching this video, you probably know that as well. So that's not as interesting to me. What's much more interesting to me is to explore the philosophy of jiu-jitsu, the principles of jiu-jitsu, the underlying principles that allow a smaller and weaker person to defeat a bigger, stronger person. How does that all work? So let's talk about it. So let's talk about what jiu-jitsu is philosophically, but before I do that, I want to mention that if you are an over 40 jiu-jitsu practitioner, I will be running something called Old Grappler Summit down here in San Diego, California this October 2024. It's a 3-day jiu-jitsu and social gathering for the over 40 crowd, where we will discuss solutions and strategies for dealing with those younger athletes that we struggle against. And if you want more information, just go to my website, rickellis.com, and hit the events tab. We are already about 30% full. Last time we sold out really fast, and we are less than 3 months away. So I have a feeling it's going to start filling up real quick here. So if you're interested, don't wait. And I look forward to meeting you and getting some good training in with you. All right, so jiu-jitsu. What is jiu-jitsu? Well, first of all, as I mentioned in the intro, it's a grappling-based martial art. There are basically two types of martial arts. There are striking arts like boxing, kickboxing, etc., where you learn to use your fists, your knees, your elbows, your feet to defeat an opponent. Or there are grappling-based martial arts that are about getting your hands on somebody and then doing something with that person. And depending on the art, the goal might be a little bit differently. But generally, the goal in grappling-based martial arts is to get your opponent to the ground. And if you look at the classic strategy that the Brazilians have espoused forever, it revolves around four strategies. There are 4 points in this strategy. Number one is you need to get your opponent to the ground. And how you do that? Well, a lot of times we use judo techniques to get our opponents to the ground, but more and more, the world of jiu-jitsu is being influenced by the world of wrestling. And I think that's the American contribution to the world of jiu-jitsu, where you've got single legs and double legs and other strategies to get the opponent to the ground. And we saw that in the early days of UFC. In the very early days, it was style versus style. And in any conflict involving, one style versus one style. You've got karate versus jiu-jitsu, or you've got boxing, versus wrestling, let's say. Generally, when it's one style versus one style, the grappling arts tend to be superior because all you have to do is keep the striker out of striking range or close the distance and get your hands on someone, and it nullifies their ability to punch and kick. And so what happened was the wrestlers began taking over in the early days of the UFC once it became a mixed martial art and people realized that you needed to train in multiple disciplines. You needed a striking discipline and some kind of grappling or discipline, some kind of takedown and grappling discipline. So principle number one, or strategy number one in the jiu-jitsu, the jiu-jitsu goal is to take your opponent to the ground. Strategy number two is to get past their guard. Now, this assumes that they have enough jiu-jitsu experience to actually play guard. A lot of times, if it's a street fight or something and you take someone to the ground, well, you're going to bypass step two, meaning you're going to get past the guard. Whereas someone that trains jiu-jitsu, they know that you always, when you're on your back, when you're playing, bottom position, you always want to keep your legs, your knees between you and your opponent, giving you control options and movement options so that they can't just flatten you out. And so the number 2 goal is to get past the guard. You can go under the legs, you can go over the legs, you can go through the legs, you can go around the legs. There are many strategies for passing the guard, but they all involve getting around the legs and getting to strategy number 3, which is get to a dominant controlling position. A lot of times that starts in side control, because as you pass the guard, generally you're going to end up in side control, or you might end up in mount, which is even more dominant. Or during that guard pass, maybe they turn away from you and you have an opportunity to take their back. The back is a very dominant position. Mount is a very dominant position, and that's a very good place to be. And then step number 4 is to get a submission, to either get a joint lock or to set up a choke. So that is classic jiu-jitsu right there. And the point system in competition jiu-jitsu reflects that goal structure. If you take someone down, it's 2 points. If you pass their guard, it's 2 points. If you get to mount, it's 4 points. If you take someone's back, it's 4 points. So the points, they increase the more dominant position you get to. Now, here's a question. Where does the leg lock game fit within that classic jiu-jitsu paradigm? Well, the Brazilians were not leg lockers. The leg lock game came much, much later. The jiu-jitsu world inherited some of that from the world of Sambo, which is a Russian martial art that has always had leg locks. John Danaher, was exposed to the leg lock game by Dean Lister, and then Danaher started really developing that in his guys, and those guys made, his competitors made a big splash on the competition scene and won a lot of matches with their leg lock game, and then the 10th Planet guys and everybody else followed suit, and now the leg lock game is really common in jiu-jitsu, but it falls outside of that classic paradigm. The normal paradigm where you take someone down, you pass their guard, you get to a dominant position, and you get the submission. Well, the leg lock game falls a little bit outside that because you're not having to pass the guard. And if you're an older athlete like I am, I love the leg lock game because honestly, some guys have very, very difficult guards to pass. And you can expend a lot of fuel trying to get past someone's guard, whereas if you just drop into a leg lock position, it can be a little more efficient. And so that's sort of what jiu-jitsu is. I further categorize martial arts into 2 types of martial arts. Yeah, there's striking arts and there's grappling arts, but I divide martial arts into what I call live arts and dead arts. Live arts are arts that are continuing to evolve, and jiu-jitsu is a martial art that is evolving very rapidly. We've seen the wrestling influence, the judo influence, the leg lock influence. We've seen, all this stuff come into the world of jiu-jitsu, and the philosophy of jiu-jitsu is pretty simple. If it works, we incorporate it. If it doesn't work, we reject it. And because of that, it's a live art. And also because we spar, we pit our skill against each other in a very direct, non-choreographed way where I'm trying to choke you, you're trying to choke me, and we're going to see who has better jiu-jitsu. And so arts that do that, arts that spar, arts that are more open-ended with their techniques, those are live arts. And dead arts are the arts that have a fixed curriculum, a fixed syllabus. It doesn't really change. And they don't really spar in those arts. They're just doing kata or forms practice. So if you're looking for a martial art to train, I would always steer you toward a live art. It doesn't have to be a grappling art like jiu-jitsu, but it needs to be a live art in which they're sparring. And so that's sort of the categorization of jiu-jitsu. But again, I want to talk about the philosophy or the principles of jiu-jitsu a little bit in this video. How are the goals in jiu-jitsu accomplished? right? How is it that you're able to take someone down? How is it that you can pass someone's guard? How is it that you can control someone in a dominant way? Well, in my opinion, at its core, Jiu-Jitsu is utilizing 4 different principles. Now, there are many, many principles in Jiu-Jitsu. There are far more than 4. Henner Gracie wrote a book recently called The 32 Principles of Jiu-Jitsu. And he applies some of those to life, to business, and so on. So it's not strictly a Jiu-Jitsu book. My instructor, Mr. Roy Dean, is about to release his new instructional. It is The Principles of Guard Passing, where he explores guard passing, not just in terms of the techniques utilized, but extracting the principles that are at play with a variety of different guard passes. Because if you can extract a principle from the techniques that you're employing, well, then it means that you can kind of invent techniques. You can make stuff up. You can find solutions dynamically in that moment based on the principle. Beginners have difficulty with principles because there's no context for the principle. So when you're a white belt, even a blue belt, a lot of times you just need to know, if they do this, you do that, right? If this, you do that. That becomes the most common way of learning jiu-jitsu. It's, what do I do if they do this? You do that. What do I do if they do that? You do that. And that's how it goes. And eventually you'll develop, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of solutions for all kinds of different scenarios. And you can actually get pretty far in your journey with that approach. It's probably the most common way to go about learning jiu-jitsu. But what happens if someone uses a technique and you don't know it? What happens if someone positions themselves in a certain way, or they're doing certain things and you don't have a specific answer? Well, if you have principles that you understand and know, then it lets you, again, kind of make stuff up on the fly to deal with those things. So I mentioned there are 4 primary principles of jiu-jitsu. This is my opinion. Your mileage may vary. And so to me, those 4 primary principles are this: connection, obstruction, deflection, and absorption. Connection, obstruction, deflection, and absorption. And so let's go through these one at a time. And, honestly, I wish I was on the mat right now because I could show some examples in action. And maybe my next video, I'll do something like that so you can see what I'm talking about. So connection. Connection is critically important when you are a grappler because you have to get a hold of somebody. Now, in the real world out there, we use our arms for almost everything. We don't really use our legs much for anything in the real world. We walk, you might jog, you might push a shopping cart, you drive a car, you do certain things, and you're employing your feet a little bit there, but we don't really use our feet the way that we use our hands. And when you watch a white belt in jiu-jitsu, you'll realize that they're just doing this. They're grabbing a lot with their hands, and they're not really using their legs very productively. So when I say connection, what ultimately I'm talking about is using your entire body to connect to your opponent. You've got 4 limbs, 2 arms, 2 legs. You should be employing those to connect to an opponent. And with your legs, you can hook, you can scissor, you can pinch, you can push. There are a lot of ways to use your legs, like, to be able to connect and use them productively. And then beyond that, you can use your entire body. You can use your head, your shoulders, your hips. Everything can be a point of connection. If you are relatively new at jiu-jitsu, when you're watching white belts spar, a lot of times you see people that don't engage. They're operating kind of on the outside. They're coming in for a little bit, then they're disengaging, constantly disengaging. You see that in competition sometimes. Guys are real skittish to commit, and so they're constantly disengaging. And I'm not saying that you don't ever want to disengage. Sometimes you do, but if you're going against someone bigger, stronger, faster than you, that has better attributes than you, you better connect, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to slow them down. If you're just trying to match their speed, then the person that's faster is always going to have an advantage. So connection is one of the foundational principles of jiu-jitsu, of any grappling art. You have to be able to connect to somebody. Number 2, obstructions. That's one way to call it, an obstruction. I think John Danaher uses the term wedge. And so wedges are very, very important, or blocking is very important. We might, everyone refers to frames. You hear that a lot in jiu-jitsu. You need to frame up. You need to have your frames in place. Frames can be your arms, your elbows. Frames can be your knees. They can be your legs. You can make frames. All of those things are just obstructions. You're creating a block. You're creating a wedge to stop somebody from being able to advance their position and do that thing they wanted to do. And so in jiu-jitsu, we are constantly making obstructions. It can be something simple. Let's say I have you in side control. I'm on the top. You are underneath me. You're trying to get that knee in to replace guard. Well, maybe I block by putting my hand on the mat so that you can't get your knee through. Or maybe I drop my hip so that you can't put your knee through. All of those things are just obstructions. They're just wedges that we're creating to deny our opponent's ability to move freely. The third principle is, connection, obstruction, deflection is the next one. What is deflection? Deflection is angling your body so that the person's frames or the person's connecting points are no longer effective. For example, let's say I have someone in side control and they're very, very strong and they push to bench press you off. Well, if I'm pushing back into those arms in a direct way, I'm pushing against bone structure, and I'm not going to be very successful against that. But if I'm being pushed and I instead turn my body and I blade myself, if their hands are here and I turn, they no longer have the ability to stay connected in a way that prevents the advancement of my position. And so deflection is something that we do a lot. Let's say someone has their knee in my chest. I'm trying to pass their guard. Their knee is in my chest. I can just turn. I can deflect. I can angle. We can deflect with our arms. We can deflect with our body. Someone throws a punch and you block. That's a form of deflection. Someone goes to push you and you angle yourself. You blade your body to take away that power when they push you. Those are all forms of deflection, and that's something that we do a lot in jiu-jitsu, sort of intuitively. White belts, not so much. Blue belts, not so much. But as your belt darkens, you'll find that you employ that much, much more. And the last one is absorption. What does it mean to absorb? Well, absorbing means that if somebody pushes you, instead of resisting it, you go with it. You're sort of adding to their momentum. If someone pulls you, you go with it. If, let's say, you're passing someone's guard and they push away at you with their legs, you simply go with it momentarily to take away their power, and then you come back in. And so there are lots of examples of absorption. And really, these 4 ideas that we're talking about, we are switching between them very, very quickly. You're not always using one or the other. You're kind of drifting back and forth. I'm trying to pass someone's guard. I'm trying to deflect the legs. He pushes. I might absorb that momentarily. Then I deflect again. Now I'm coming in. Now he's got frames against me. I've got to deal with those frames. Maybe I deflect further. Maybe I create some obstruction so they can't implement their game, so that we can get to a controlling position and getting a finish. So to me, those are the most fundamental of the principles of jiu-jitsu. And again, I wish I was on the mat showing this stuff, because I think some examples could be in order. But there are many other principles of jiu-jitsu, probably too many to count. I mean, controlling the inside. I mean, that's another principle. You see this in wrestling, right? Inside control. You always want inside control. In the leg lock game, you generally are looking for inside control. regardless of position, the person who has inside control generally is going to have more advantages versus someone that has outside control. There is a principle that Roy Dean mentioned in his new instructional, which is limb substitution. Limb substitution is the idea that if I'm using my arm, let's say, to control maybe your wrist, well, my arm is out of play as long as I'm using it to control. So maybe instead I switch off that job to my shin, and now I can free up my hand to be able to do something else. So a lot of times we use our limbs, but then we need to hand off to another limb. So there's, limb substitution. And I don't want this video to be too long, so I'm not going to go deeply into all the other principles. I don't even know if I know all of the principles in jiu-jitsu, but what I'm really curious is to hear from you guys. I would love to have a conversation below and hear whether there are principles that have really helped your game. What was that first principle that just kind of was a light bulb that went off, like, oh, I see, I need to, do this or that. For example, don't put your arms on the mat. Generally, we are taught when you're in someone's guard, don't put your hands on the mat, because that exposes you to arm bars and kimuras and omoplatas and that sort. Now, that's not it's a principle. It's not an ironclad principle. There are always exceptions to the principles. But don't put your hands on the mat. Keep your legs in front of your opponent if you're playing guard. I mean, these are, basic foundational principles. So I want to hear your principles. Is there one principle that really changed your life and changed your reality? And maybe it's something that I haven't heard of. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys below. So those are my thoughts, and I look forward to talking to you guys next time.